Unfortunately, they had to shut down Abu Dhabi airport and he wasn't able to take over the previous day, so he only arrived in time for dinner actually after the lecture on Monday. But we're delighted that so many of you could come back today, and I know that quite a lot of people were disappointed and had other engagements today. I am David Ford. I'm the director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme that is sponsoring this event, and Dr. Aref Ali Nayed, who will be speaking to us, is a senior advisor of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme. He's been involved with us since the very beginning of the programme, actually. We had a 24-hour event, I remember, when we were conceiving it way back in 2002, I think. And he took part in that. And it was very much the DNA that was worked out then of the programme that as we've been trying to work out over the past 10 years or so. And he's been a very good friend to us year after year. He was educated in largely in Canada, actually, in Guelph University. He did a doctorate, he did his first degree in engineering, then a master's in philosophy of science, and then a doctorate in hermeneutics. And he both studied in the Gregorian University in Rome, the Papal University in Rome, and also later taught there. But he eventually became a professor in the University of Malaysia. And it was from there that his father summoned him home when he had got ill and was no longer able to run the family business, to head up the family computer business in Tripoli and Dubai, based in Tripoli and Dubai. And so for the last 12 years or so, Aref has been heading up a computer company as well as doing a great many other things, such as refounding an Ottoman madrasa in Tripoli, and also founding Kalam Research and Media in Knowledge Village in Dubai. He has also been his tribe in Libya has been one of the main tribes in Libya, and his father was actually the leader of this tribe until he died a couple of years ago. And Aref is now also very much involved with leadership in there. So he has had a varied array of experience, but we take up the story tonight with the Libyan Revolution, which began in February, and Aref has been actively involved there. Some of you may have heard, right at the beginning of that revolution, Aref being interviewed on the Today programme on BBC. That was before it started spreading, and immediately after that he had to obviously leave Tripoli and get his family out of Tripoli as well. And he will take up the story from then when he speaks to us. But we are also delighted to have with us this evening Ed Stourton, who most of you who ever listen to radio in particular will know as one of the most distinguished broadcasters in this country. He's been a founder member of Channel 4 News. He has had some of the most choice overseas correspondent roles. I mean, in Washington, in Paris, in Bosnia during the...
Not sure Bosnia quite ranks with the other two.
in Iraq during the Gulf War, in other words, he's been around the world, but also has that very unusual and valuable characteristic of being an extremely sensitive, perceptive reporter, commentator, thinker in relation to religion. And he did a major series in the late 1990s on the Roman Catholic Church and wrote a book in the aftermath of that as well. And more recently, having been involved in the Today programme and all sorts of other programmes, he is the host for the Sunday programme. And we are really delighted to have you with us tonight, and especially the fact that Aref, not having arrived on Monday, has been able to come here with us this evening. So, without more ado, I want to invite Aref to just open with... The form of this will be that Aref will talk for about 10-15 minutes, just giving an introduction to the Libyan Revolution. And then Ed will take over, and both ask questions and open it up to you. So do please weigh in with your questions when you're invited to, and we'll go on till 6:30. So over to you, Aref.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, ala alihi wa sahbihi. Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I am really deeply sorry for missing Monday and the inconvenience of those who came and then had to come back, or those who could not make it. I'm also grateful to Ed for agreeing to come back and
nice
taking the train from London to.
We met. Can everyone hear you, Aref? Or do you need to use the microphone? Can everyone hear? No. You need to use the microphone, I think. Yes.
Like this?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Ed, for coming back for today. It's been a great blessing to be, in a way, part of this Faculty of Divinity and the Cambridge Interfaith program. I have been a very bad friend and partner in many ways, because I seldomly don't show up, and I usually have to rush back before I had planned for, and so on. So, but despite all this, I find that coming here, even for short periods and even for truncated visits, is always a great joy and a great opportunity to reflect upon the many happenings in our part of the world and in my life personally. It's oftentimes when you're in the midst of the commotion of life and events are happening so fast, it is amazingly important to step out of what's happening every once in a while and reflect upon the processes that overtake one's life. And I find Cambridge to be a great place to come to reflect and think and be amongst friends and to talk deeply with mutual love and respect with people about whom I care a lot, and like David and the rest of the colleagues here. And so it's a great joy to be here. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly happened in the Libyan revolution. Things have been happening and are still happening and continue to happen. And it's very difficult to really make sense of it all. And I've been trying, and I haven't been able to read books on revolution and theoretical reflections on revolution as much as I would have liked to maybe help make sense of things. But Ed Marks, my friend and colleague at Kalam Research and Media, gave me the book of Hannah Arendt on the way into London, and I read bits and pieces from the book on the plane. And at the end of the book, I jumped to the end. She speaks of a very interesting phenomenon of what she calls local councils arising in revolutionary situations spontaneously, and she sees this kind of human ability for action and for surprising others in ways unexpected to be very essential to revolution. She also notes that oftentimes revolutionary local councils very quickly give in to what she calls professional revolutionaries, who kind of take over the revolution and change it into partisan politics instead of this spontaneous longing for freedom that it starts with. And I was amazed at how strikingly similar, what she was describing to the situation in Libya. As a Libyan, I've longed for the day when we'll get rid of Gaddafi for many years. I've discussed even with David at times, and expressed frustrations, and I gave a lecture a year before the revolution in Sidi al-Masri Zawiya in Tripoli, in which I talked about the crisis of compassion in Libya and the abundance of cruelty, and longed for a day when freedom will come. But I was never expecting what has happened. It was an amazing springing forth of so many young people all at once, and all together in so many parts of Libya, and in ways that were, I think, completely unpredictable. It was very difficult. I would have never predicted that things would happen that way. One would have expected maybe a military coup or some intelligence officers making a kind of an intelligence coup, like what happened in Tunisia before when Zain al-Abidin came to power. but not this kind of popular uprising. And it really was a popular uprising. Everybody participated, men, women, young and old, even children. And it was an amazing thing to be part of this spring, in the sense of springing up. And it's as if, you know, in each heart there was like a kind of a spring that was compressed for so many years, and then finally there was this release of energy. And the energy of it all was just amazing, and to be part of it and to actually witness it was an astonishing experience. But as it ended, and in victory for the Libyan people and liberation and the demise of the Gaddafi regime, and the energy was in a way spent and kind of completed its action, we began to see other phenomena that were not very pleasing to one's heart, and which are worrying in many ways. And one of the phenomena is this professional revolutionaries, parties who were historically parties. And Libyan parties are a rarity. I mean, we didn't have parties, but there were some parties. And some of them were even made a kind of a reconciliation with Saif al-Islam Gaddafi at one point, and were very reluctant to join the revolution in the first few days. But eventually, once they saw the opportunity, kind of rode the wave. And through their meticulous organization and good funding and kind of strategic thinking, and managed to start to take over in many ways key committees in the National Transitional Council, key local council committees, and began to already prepare themselves to stack the deck in a way for the election that's forthcoming. And I began to see that the enthusiasm of the young people, the aspirations, the dreams, were in a way in danger of being derailed in many ways, and maybe, to use maybe stronger language, maybe robbed, And it is interesting that if you look at the footage on television, and this is the case in the Libyan revolution and also in the Egyptian revolution, lesser extent in the Tunisian revolution, the faces that were in the revolt in the early days are different from the faces in the latter days. It's as if there is a shifting of the demography of the revolution, and also the composition of the revolutionaries. And I think we need theoretical tools and ways to reflect on this, to understand what exactly is happening. And I think Hannah Arendt provides some clues as to maybe things that can be used to understand this. Be that as it may, I was wondering what it is that we revolted against, and what it is that we're seeking, by way of trying to understand what we've done and where we're going. And I think if I were to summarize what we revolted against, I would say it was three things basically. Tyranny, which is I think was a major thing. The second thing, corruption, which is extremely important as a motivator for revolt. I think it was one of the key reasons people revolted. And the third one is cruelty. People were just fed up with the cruelty of the Gaddafi regime. And if I were to ask myself today, is the revolution successful? Have we overcome these three things? I think that the answer would be we're only partially successful. We've overcome a tyrant, but maybe we have not overcome tyranny in our own hearts, and we have not stopped tyrannizing each other, I think, because I already see a lot of kind of pushing each other around happening at the National Council, at the local councils, and between even preachers of religion and different religious directions. If I ask the question, have we overcome corruption? I think not. This is a key area of failure, I think. Many of the most corrupt officials of the Libyan regime became actually supporters of certain streaks within the new revolutionary ranks, and are already attempting to fund parties and already own television stations. And some of the most corrupt oil officials are still there in direct and indirect ways. So I'm not so sure we've overcome corruption. And as for cruelty, I think this is where we feel the most. The removal of cruelty involved cruelty. It was not a peaceful revolution. It was peaceful in the beginning, but when Gaddafi's forces attacked the demonstrators with the anti-aircraft guns, people took up arms, and it became a cruel struggle. But that's understood to some extent, that you would need cruelty to overcome cruelty. But what I cannot understand, and what's really, I think, a great failure, is the fact that there is still cruelty after liberation. And this is happening in illegal detention centers and amongst militias. Recently, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International talked about this phenomenon. It also made it into UN reports. And I believe that this is probably the most important failure of the revolution. And it is extremely urgent that this gets addressed. So is the Libyan revolution successful? I would say partially. Is there another round in the Libyan revolution? I think most probably yes. There will be another round, a revolution too, because most notably the corruption thing, I think, is going to cause the most issue for people. I'm not sure that the tyranny and the cruelty will be the biggest motivator, but I think the corruption issue is going to be a big issue, and it is extremely important that we try to address these three issues without another round of violent action. And one of the biggest issues that I have today is like, how do we overcome these things without having to go through another fight? And I'm not so sure that I've got all the answers for this, but I think one extremely important thing is the role of religious scholars and theologians and preachers. There are various schools of Islam in Libya. I belong to the most traditional streak, the Ash'ari, Maliki, Sufi line. And I believe that there is a big responsibility on the scholars of the country to develop a theology of compassion and the preaching of compassion that can overcome the cruelty, most notably. For me, that's the most important. And that can overcome the tyranny and the corruption through propagating values of truth and transparency and trust and basically national reconciliation. But maybe more about these as we address some of the questions. Forgive me for taking too long, but by way of maybe just opening the discussion, I hope these remarks will
be fascinating. I mean, it's wonderful and encouraging to people like us outside who've had such difficulty understanding what's been going on in the region as a whole, to hear someone like you who's been part of it all saying you're still trying to figure out what happened, because we felt slightly defeated sometimes, I think, by the complexity of it. I also can't help being struck by the fact, as you speak, in quite a critical way about your country, that you are, of course, an ambassador of the Libyan government. I don't think you'd hear a British ambassador speaking about Britain in those days. And that's a mark, I suppose, of how much has changed in Libya, because under the old regimes, certainly that would not have been possible, would it? We better deal with some of the hard things first. I mean, for example, just looking at this weekend's newspapers, the headline, "Angry Libyans turn against their rebels," and there does seem to be quite a lot of reporting a sense of real frustration among many people who were with the rebels about the lack of progress in terms of things like jobs and so forth. How serious a problem is that, do you think?
Well, I think it is a very serious problem. The problem with Libya is the legacy. 42 years is a long time, and there are so many accumulated issues and problems that have never been addressed. When you have lots of money, sometimes you can cover up a lot of issues for a long time and not fix them, and just keep throwing money at them at critical moments, and you get the feeling that they're gone or that you've made progress, but In fact, they come back to haunt you. And I think what's happened with the removal of the Gaddafi regime,
What that is. Try a bit more.
with the removal of the Gaddafi regime, you have in many ways,
Do you want to try mine? See if that works.
yeah,
Or
sorry.
is it no? Needs to turn on. It was okay. Keep going.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
Okay.
Just keep it a bit closer to yours.
Okay. Basically, you have the cumulative effect of all these issues, and one of the key issues is high unemployment, poverty of youth, the inability of young people to get married and live in decent homes. There's a housing shortage, shortage of decent jobs. Education is pretty destroyed, pretty much destroyed. Medical care is really bad. Like people would go to Tunisia and Jordan for medical care, and all these things have been there for a long time. When the liberation happened, and this is something that I'm not happy about, most people are so fixated with the security issue. They are so focused on the guns or the paying off of the revolutionary youth or the healthcare for the wounded, as if these are the priorities and these are the only things to be paid attention to. And they are very important issues, but I think that we must take a much broader perspective of what security is. I think it will be much easier to solve the security issues if we address the fundamental needs of people. If we need to jumpstart the economy, we need to rebuild the health sector, we need to rebuild the universities, we need to rebuild education. We need to get housing going, housing projects going, create jobs, and I don't think that we need to wait for the elected government to do that. In my view, and I was the operations coordinator for the stabilization team, our plan was that part of stabilization was already very early on jump-starting the economy and beginning with these projects, not waiting and saying, no, we must have security first, because the best way to have security is to even pretend that life is normal. And if you even bluff it in the beginning and just begin the projects, resume the building, fix the airport, fix the port, and just get busy with rebuilding the country, life will become normal. But there is this sense of waiting in Libya, which I think has cost us dearly. This notion that, we're only a transitional government, so let us wait until we fix the security issue. It's not going to get fixed that way. So as for being critical and being an ambassador, I am still the ambassador of Libya to the UAE, but because I've resigned several times without success.
But at this moment...
maybe I'm going out of my way to be fired.
And I'm fascinated by what you say about cruelty, because I was going to ask you about the news, whatever it was, a week or so ago, that the Médecins Sans Frontières had decided to pull out of a detention centre in Misrata because they were treating people who they thought had been beaten up and tortured. Do you see, as somebody who sees what's going on in the government, do you see any serious institutional effort by the leadership to deal with that sort of thing?
There are efforts, and I think there are genuine efforts and sincere efforts, but I don't think that they are intense enough or strong enough for a variety of reasons. I remember in the early days after the liberation of Tripoli, we had meetings with the Justice Minister, and the stabilization team invited Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and we talked to the Justice Minister and explained to him that he is personally liable for anything that happens, and that the Prime Minister is personally liable for anything that happens to people. And he was taken aback by this, and he was saying that we have no effective control over the militias or the detention centers and so on. And my argument back was that you cannot claim that you don't have control, because we demanded recognition by arguing that we do have control over Libyan territory. So you can't, legally, you cannot really wiggle out of it. I think there is I believe that if there is a failure of the NTC on this, it's thinking that their helplessness to affect protection or change is going to be an excuse for not doing so. Meaning, it would have been better to resign than to let this happen under one's own guard. And it's extremely important that people are held responsible for what's happening. We can blame Gaddafi for 42 years of abuse, but since the liberation of Tripoli and since we demanded recognition, NTC is responsible. And I dare say that they better fix it and fast, because it is thousands of people in detention and there is torture. And it's real. And if people say, oh, it's not as extensive as people say, I think that's really a lousy answer, because in Islam, even torturing one person or killing one person or detaining one person unfairly is a grave crime against humanity. It's not. I think numbers should not matter. Even one tortured person is too much. So I believe that now we're seeing that the Justice Ministry, the new Justice Ministry, is really trying, and that they are trying to extend control over the detention centers. They are putting in mechanisms for better oversight. But still, the system is overloaded. The number of detainees is far too large to be processed through a juridical system that has collapsed already. There are vast problems in detention centers in terms of the facilities and the infrastructures. So I'm not in any way underestimating the difficulties. There are huge difficulties. But despite all these difficulties, I do believe that more leadership should be shown and to put a stop to these.
And you don't think that key message of responsibility has really got through to the NTC? They really understand that it is now up to them.
I think the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty International report and the Doctors Without Frontiers reports of the last week did hit home very hard. The fact that they've made it to the UN, the fact that Ian Martin of the UN brought this up, I think is gotten everyone's attention. And I do believe that measures are being taken. Yes, the NTC has great difficulties in extending control over everything, but still, at least there should be even if you cannot do something, at least I would say resign or at least rhetorically try to. But I think better things are happening. But I personally feel dissatisfied with the progress. This was flagged very early on, and in official meetings, and not enough has been done. And I think one day after the election, an elected government may choose to actually bring people to
justice.
Yeah. So it's and that's a real possibility. People will ask the justice ministers of today what's happening, and it's people should be aware of this. And it's
the elections are in June, which is a tight timetable.
Yeah.
You criticise what you call professional revolutionaries, in other words, people with previous political experience. But you could argue, given that tight timetable, given the whole electoral process and forming a government is quite a complicated thing to do, that actually you need a few people with basic political skills, that the enthusiasm of the young demonstrators, wonderful though it may be, and the bravery of the fighters and so forth, isn't actually enough when it comes to practical politics.
I agree. My problem is with the tactics that are not honorable. You know, when Gaddafi and Mubarak were chasing certain parties and oppressing them, I could see justification for secret action and clandestine action and not being forthright about one's identity and one's plans. These movements had to do that in order to survive and work. I believe today everybody has to declare who they are, where they get their money from, what do they want, how are they organized, what are their intentions, and to be forthright about this. And already in Libya I'm seeing NGOs being penetrated by various political operators without declaring who they are. I already see foreign money coming in without being declared. I already see religious preachers on television praising well-known thieves and corrupt politicians of the past and calling them heroes now. And these tactics are not worthy of the great sacrifice of the young Libyan people who died in in this war. Too much price has been paid for such cheap tactics to be used, and it's already happening. And I'm really worried about the country. I believe that when I talk about professional revolutionaries, I'm talking about robbers of revolutions. I'm not talking about moral, ethical politicians. Of course, they are very much needed. But I'm afraid that too many tricks are being played. And I worry that by the time we get to election, it is the crooks who will dominate, and that we will end up with barons who own entire parties and own television stations who will control us for the next decade or so.
So they won't be truly free elections, that's your concern, or they won't?
You know, elections can only be free if there is a fair starting point. You know, we are in a chaos, and chaotic systems are highly sensitive to initial conditions. And if the initial conditions begin skewed and unfairly tilted, you will end up with artificial victories through money and through manipulation. And I don't think that that's what the young people died for. And I feel personally responsible to every young person who was martyred, not to let their blood go in vain, even if it costs our own blood. That we should, if we were not scared of Gaddafi, we will not be scared of any political party that tries to play these games. And they're already doing it. And and the young people know. And they're saying this on Facebook. And they're not being listened to. And not enough change is being affected. And if people continue to do this, we will have a second revolution. We're already seeing signs of this in Benghazi and Tripoli with the stormings of the council and the storming of the local council of Tripoli.
And it's really reached the point where you can talk in terms of the possibility of a second revolution, you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I've got lots of other things I want to ask you about the Arab Spring in general and what you said about the place of religion, but there's a lot there to talk about. I don't know whether anybody wants to come in at this point and ask a question specifically on what's been happening in Libya. Yes. Do you mind saying who you are when you introduce yourself?
It's my pleasure. Hi, I'm Jason Pack. I'm an academic of Libya. I've been in Tripoli and the rest of the country a few times over the last year. And I have a report coming out about the Libyan militias in a month's time in a think tank in DC. I totally agree with your vision about if you wait for there to be security, and if the NTC says we don't have the legitimacy to act now, well then there isn't going to be security because they're not, you know, getting the thawar off the street and jobs programs and all that building. And it's great to hear you say it, but the question is about actions. I felt in your speech you were attacking two discrete tendencies and not identifying them. So I see the corrupt kind of people from the old regime, maybe the Saifiyin, entirely different than the problem of the professional revolutionaries, meaning people in the Misratan or Zintani militias who were excluded previously and now have a whole range of concerns of turning the society upside down.
Yeah.
So my question relates to the militias. What is the thing that you guys can do immediately to use the unfrozen assets to address the problem of there being so much power in the periphery in these militias?
When I talked about professional revolutionaries, I'm not specifically referring to the militias themselves of Misrata or Zintan, just to be clear. I'm referring to political parties that have existed and that continue to exist. And I will not mention them by name because they're not here, and it's not fair to mention them by name. So they have to have the chance to defend themselves. But now you say two distinct groups. There are actually three, okay? And they're all linked. Meaning, you've got the corrupt money, you've got the professional revolutionaries. These are actual parties, okay? And then you've got the militias. And the scariest thing I see today is corrupt money financing certain political parties or tendencies and financing particular militias, so that you get.
Can you give an example?
I won't. Because I will simply not name them by name, but I won't. But if you're following the Libyan case, there is a particular preacher that came on television, and the television station is owned by one of the tycoons, And he basically polished that tycoon. And that very tycoon has a militia that's totally financed by him and his brothers. And this is the scary stuff. I don't think that we lost so many lives for this kind of thing to happen. And it should not be allowed to happen. The young people are not going to let it happen. I mean, they already know. But it's, yeah. Now,
So what can be done?
What can be done is that the government has to be absolutely brave and courageous and make some really difficult decisions, even if it costs them very dearly. And one of them is to begin immediate investigations into the funds of not more than a dozen people who are well known to own billions. Like somebody who has a salary of 1,000 dinars who owns 1 billion dinars, they have to account for where they got the money from. And I think if they even begin symbolic investigation of 3 or 4 individuals to at least put them back, because these guys kind of waited just immediately after liberation for a little while, and when they saw that the coast was clear, that they're not going to be even investigated, have now the nerve to actually not only come back into the country, but to actually begin to finance things, including political parties and television stations and militias. So there has to be some anti-corruption investigation started right away. And this is part of transitional justice. It has to start. And the second thing, which is extremely important, is to stop this nonsense about paying revolutionary youth salaries. I mean, that's an insult to the youth who fought for love of country and freedom, who were not mercenaries and were not expecting salaries. And I know many of these young people who fought who are not taking any money from the government. Meanwhile, many pretenders who, what I call post-liberation revolutionaries, have signed up and are taking the money. And what this has done is it has made like a dishing out money system that's simply unhealthy. So stop doing that and stop creating the projects and giving people employment rather than just handouts. And there's plenty to do in the country. I mean, just the housing projects should keep thousands of people busy, And I think this is the sort of thing that has to happen.
Anybody else at this stage like to come in with a question? Yes. Do you mind again just saying who you are?
Sorry, my name's Michael Watson. I just am very interested in the Middle East as a whole. I'm not an academic. I was going to ask, where is Saif al-Islam now and what is likely to happen to him?
Saif al-Islam is in the, from what I hear, is in the Zintan area. And he's under arrest. And the public prosecutor of Libya has a representative on the premise where he's being held, so he's under the justice system, and they are coordinating with the International Criminal Court on how to proceed forward. From what I hear, he is safe and being well treated, and there was television footage to that effect. I do hope and pray that he will get a fair trial, as any Libyan who gets arrested should be getting a fair trial. And I believe that it is important to ask about the conditions of detention and his condition and so on, but it's also very important to ask about the 8,000 or so other detainees who also are very important and should be given due process. And yeah.
Yes.
I'm Stuart Laying, former ambassador in the Middle East, but not in North Africa. So this is an area fairly strange to me. My question is this: during the Revolutionary War, there was quite a lot of talk in the British press, anyway, about tribal elements on both sides. And my question is this: to what extent is there correlation between tribal affiliation in these groups that you've been speaking about? Or to what extent are these groups simply people who've got together because they want money or power or whatever else they may be looking for?
The tribes in Libya are important, but they are not the only factor. And tribalism exists in various gradations in Libya. So you can find some city dwellers who are completely cosmopolitan and have no tribal affiliation. And you can also encounter Libyans who are nearly completely tribal. So what you have in Libya is a very complex matrix with various factors. One of them is tribalism, another is religiosity, and that also has different flavors. Tribal, you can call them religious tribes of sorts, and there is also party tribes, and there is also things like townships and cities, and also regional considerations, and all of these factors together form a very complex differential equation that's very difficult to analyze and solve in many ways. Anybody who ignores tribes in Libya does so at their own peril, because I think they are a very important factor. But also to exaggerate it and make it into the factor in Libya is also not correct. There are many differences, many nuances, and it would be very complicated to dwell into this. But most tribes actually split. It was not these tribes versus these other tribes. The war was between pro-Gaddafi versus anti-Gaddafi forces, and these were mixed. And certain tribes, like my own Warfella tribe, was split. As you know, Bani Walid was one of the last, actually the last, perhaps. I mean, apart from Sirt, town to be liberated. And yet, Warfella, including myself and not few, but many others, including some of the first people who stormed the camp in Benghazi, were involved in the pro-revolutionary forces. And this is across the board. You've got, yes, in certain cities or towns or tribes, it was more or less, but you did have a national split in many ways. So it wasn't along tribal lines, but the tribal element did affect things. Also, past tribal alliances, historical alliances, did affect things. So it's extremely important for democracy to emerge, for there to be a genuine social contract. And one of the things we must keep in mind when talking about Libya is that the social contract will not be just a contract between individuals, because the level of individuality differs depending on how much tribal affiliation or feeling there is. In some cases, you would need a social contract between clans and tribes, in a way. And that will be a kind of a consensus and a social contract reached between, for example, the Masrata, which is a townish kind of tribal group. I mean, it's not exactly a tribe, okay? The Warfella, the Zintan, the Ridat, these are large blocks that do have to reach some sort of an understanding. But this understanding can only be reached through other factors like politics, like party politics, and like religious discussions also. Because also in religion we've got Salafis of a whole set of variety, ranging from Salafi jihadists to very moderate Salafis. And we've got the Sufis, and we've got the Ikhwan, we've got the Tabligh, we've got... And there has to be a national discussion and a national kind of settlement in open discussion that can bring about democracy. And we need to look for those spoilers that would spoil such an open discussion from happening. Bad money is one major spoiler, and I see it very active these days. And that's one big spoiler, and I think we have to pay attention to it. The other thing is the big spoiler is feelings of vengeance and anger, and there is a lot of reconciliation that has to happen, a lot of preaching of forgiveness, and it's a long, complicated process. Forgive me for the rambling, but it's because I don't have clarity on all these issues, and I'm trying to, maybe for the first time, deal with them. You know?
Can I pick you up on the point you make about religion? You said earlier that you hope that scholars would be a source of reconciliation and should work hard for that. But if you look across, certainly in the Middle East, very often religious fault lines have been sources of conflict. It seems to be happening more and more in Syria at the moment.
Yeah.
How serious are the fault lines that you've just referred to in Libya?
Well, some of them are quite serious. I mean, the fact that we have, like, for example, traditionally in Libya, we had reverence for the tombs of great sages and scholars. And recently we've had a sequence of a strand, not all Salafis, but a strand of Salafism, blowing up these tombs and even taking out the dead and the remains and throwing them in wadis or valleys. And this is a very serious fault line and has caused major issues. Last week there was a demonstration about this. And now, for example, we have the Mawlid of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and already they're distributing pamphlets saying that this is haram, bid'ah, and so on. And Sufis who form the Tripolitanian tradition in a way have their processions that are about to happen on Saturday. So these frictions are there. Libya used to have a consensus that was basically Ash'ari, Maliki, Sufi for about 1,000 years. Gaddafi managed to destroy this consensus by suppressing religious teaching through his so-called cultural revolution. And in that gap, many other trends have entered, including Wahhabi tendencies and various Afghan like jihadi Salafi tendencies. And so there definitely are fault lines. The only solution for these is dialogue and discussion. And there are some serious efforts towards this. We have been talking as much as we could. And unfortunately, as you rightly say, religion may augment the issues rather than solve them. But I do believe that the essence of Islam is compassion and forgiveness. And we are not talking enough about that in Libya, and we're not developing the discourses and the preaching that is necessary for a true national reconciliation. As you rightly say, I mean, if the religious scholars cannot reconcile with each other, how can they help with national reconciliation? It's a valid question.
Would else like to come in at this point? Yes.
My name is James Barker. I'm the Professor of Archaeology, and I've worked in Libya from 1975 onwards, and I'm running a project which is digging a prehistoric cave about 3 hours east of Benghazi. I just wonder what your reflections are about, I mean, how you see the Libyan economy developing. As you said, there's an immediate sense of, you said, well, you can get kind of, there's rebuilding, in a sense, there's a Keynesian sort of way you can get people into work like that. But, you know, as you say, it's been a kind of artificial economy. It's been protected by oil. I can think of, you know, families where there are 2 or 3 generations that never really worked. And I can also see where people I knew kind of were farming and so on 30 years ago, when now it was all done by hired labour. And I just think of, you know, what's your sense beyond, you know, if one can get it back going, and you move, and you do have a new sort of Libya beyond the reconstruction, how do you see that sort of economy?
Very challenging question, I think.
You recreate education. I mean, it's going to be relatively easier to get education back, the medical system back, and so on and so forth. But in a country where, again, you've got, you know, limited oil, it's not going to turn into a kind of industrial factory. I often, you know, find myself perturbed about how my friends and their children and their grandchildren, what kind of society they will be trying to create in the economic terms to sustain it.
Well, while what you say is true, you know, there are people who've gotten used to not working and expecting a government salary at the end of the month. It's also true, and I've directly hired young Libyans in IT and communications. There are brilliant young people who really would love to be trained and who can do things. I believe that though we are an oil country, we can do a lot with solar energy. Being a supplier of solar energy to Europe, for example, the Libyan desert is amazingly well suited for this. We can be suppliers of IT production. Silica is in abundance. We can do, and also software. There are many areas that can be developed. And one immediate thing that, I mean, if the council simply announces that if you're a certain age, you can have free English instruction and basic computer skills, for example, and just basic training, you know, and just get people busy learning, and you know, you may not be able to create all the jobs, but at least you can create the training opportunities, and there is an abundance of money for that kind of work, and that is work, like training is work. And Libyan young people are innovative. They've worked under difficult conditions, even in the 80s during the embargo, and you will see these young traders bringing in things from Malta and Tunisia, and like they're very active. It's just that they don't have opportunities, and I think that we need to diversify the economy. I think that I hope to God that we will never build the biggest steel factory in North Africa or the biggest cement factory. I mean, most of what the factories that Gaddafi built were polluting factories that destroyed the environment and destroyed people's lives. So I believe that there is an abundance of industries. I believe that there can be a sensible, ecologically sensitive tourism, for example, not the tourism of pizza boxes and beer, but the tourism of people looking at the archaeological sites and the beautiful natural resources that we've got in the Eastern Mountain. So I believe there are plenty of opportunities. The problem is the government is waiting until elections, and I feel that it's very annoying because the very waiting stance is destabilizing. They should just start with something. Even just English language instruction, basic, Microsoft training. And I'm sure some of the big companies would love to come and help with these things. Just to promote their brands, perhaps.
Can I ask you a much broader question relating to the whole place of religion in what's been happening in the region as a whole? I think one of the things that startled people outside was the fact you had in Tunisia and Egypt, you had revolutions that seemed to be secular in many ways. Elections happen and Islamist parties do very well, and in Egypt the Salafi party has done really remarkably well, which raises the question of what Islam's place is going to be in what everyone hopes are the new democracies that emerge from that process. It's a sort of big philosophical question in a way, but it's quite a pressing one too, isn't it?
It is. I think that the whole region is religious in a way, and Islam cannot be ignored in this whole region, and even secularists. It's strange. Even the ones who are almost anti-religious, they tend to be religious in
a Muslim way,
in being anti-religious. So I think it's impossible to avoid. What's extremely important is that theological work, serious theological work, must go forward into trying to come up with ways of talking about democracy and exercising democracy that are in line with the spiritual heritage of these countries, and at the same time open to the building of civil society, a true pluralism and diversity that is essential to democracy. What I see in Libya is an attempt by certain Islamist streaks or lines to monopolize Islam and monopolize God. It's like saying, if you're with me, then you're a Muslim and you're with God, and if you're not with me, then you're not a proper Muslim and you're not with God. And I believe one of the most urgent tasks of proper scholars in Libya is to get together and say, look, you cannot use God in that way in politics. And this is not to say that God is not important for politics. It's simply you cannot possess God and use him as an instrument or a hammer against your opponents in elections, which is already happening in Libya. There are pamphlets being distributed in Tripoli University that say that voting for a Almani or secular person is haram, is forbidden, and that's ludicrous. And the scholars have to say something about this. Unfortunately, the diversity of religious opinions is not reflected in the new ifta function, nor in the Ministry of the Awqaf. This is something that I personally have talked to the Mufti about and the Minister of the Awqaf and also to the government, saying that you must populate the Council of Ifta to make sure that all the diversity of religious opinion is represented, and that the Awqaf Minister should not use his ministry to impose his brand of Islam on the preachers. Or one of the key things that regimes like Gaddafi's did was to centralize all the religious endowments and the control of the mosques. And we kind of, like post liberation, just assume that that continues. I believe that one of the most important acts would be to return what were called the private endowments, so that the madrasas and the mosques would have their own kind of endowment and have a pluralism of endowments without centralized control, so that you don't end up with a regime ever again controlling religiosity. I'm afraid that there is a cheap way to impose your school by, in a way, maintaining the old system of centralized command and control over religion. And this is what I urge the Mufti and the Minister to not do, not to enjoy the centralization that was really an inheritance from Gaddafi, to impose their own school on everybody else. And I kept telling the other scholars that, look, we don't have to be content with the centralized awqaf system, that if these guys don't listen and do not include us all, then maybe we'll do away with the whole system. And this is an argument that has to go on not only in Libya, but I think this question will be raised in Egypt regarding the awqaf and even the Azhar and how it's run, the Dar al-Ifta al-Misriya and how it's run, and also in Tunisia, how Zaytuna is. I mean, Zaytuna should not be controlled by a political Islamist party. Zaytuna is much grander than any party, And I think that the traditional scholars who are historically very quiet and prayerful and so on have to be vocal or risk losing their voice forever, because if they don't stand up for what's right, and if they cannot give a message to young people that's conducive to a better life, then they might as well just, how can I say? Maybe I shouldn't.
No, you've got the picture.
Yeah.
What about the question of the way and the degree to which Islam should be constitutionally recognised? Because that's also quite a sensitive issue.
If you ask Libyans, they will all tell you that it should be there in the constitution. I don't think that there is a difference on that. I think the difference is on what that means exactly. So when you say Sharia, what do you mean by Sharia? And there are modern versions of what Sharia means that are, how can I put it, flattened engineering-like systems of basically sets of rules. So this is Sharia; it's a set of rules, and when you want to apply Sharia, you simply apply these rules. Okay, and the application is a matter of taking the rule and applying it to the situation. This kind of mechanized Sharia is actually not traditional. It's actually a kind of a modern version of what Sharia was like. Sharia in its original sense of being broad way, a path to God, a spiritual journey, as well as a set of rituals and kind of guidelines in life. That broader notion of Sharia is very different. So when you say, should Sharia be the basis for the constitution, if you mean by Sharia the first set, I will definitely say absolutely not. If you say, is it the second, I would say yes, because I believe that the Libyan people are Muslims and they have every right to live and to live by a Muslim constitution or Islamic constitution, but broadly conceived, so that you're talking about the intentionalities of the law and the spirit of the law, not merely the letter of the law. So the issue, I think, again, will come back to the clash between versions of Islam that are literal and flattened and rule-based, versus versions of Islam that are much richer and spiritual and more open-ended and more accommodating. In the Maliki tradition, which is the historical tradition of Libya, urf, or custom, was one of the sources of the Sharia. So the habits of people, the norms in a society were taken into consideration. The maslaha or what is called what is good for society, or to put it in philosophical terms, utility, but not utility as in the narrow sense of utility. Helpfulness would be a better word, has to be considered as a source of legislation, for example. So the older, richer tradition, I think, can be invoked and has can be actually conducive to a very good and democratic constitution. But I'm worried that I don't want to say McDonald's, or because that in a way maybe I could get sued by McDonald's. But there's
pretty safe.
But there is a kind of a mech Sharia in a way, a fast food version of Sharia, of take the rule, apply it, mechanical thing. That's preached by some Islamist movements, that is actually quite alien to the tradition. It's amazing how non-traditional it is, and yet it tries to monopolize religiosity and calls the religious scholars who are the heirs of the tradition innovators, and innovators in the bad sense of innovators, like heretical in a sense. So
it matters a lot, though, doesn't it? I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but something that struck me when I was in Egypt just before Christmas is that the question of the way that underpinning of Sharia works is critical to whether minorities feel comfortable in the society, and only if minorities feel comfortable do you have a true democracy, don't you? So that's got to be got right in the long term, hasn't it?
Absolutely, and look at the traditional approach to Sharia, like the old Azhari approach, before the Azhar got Nasserized and secularized, in the bad sense of secularized by Nasser, and also in many ways mutilated. The old Azhar tradition was quite accommodating of minorities, just as the Ottoman millet system, for example, was. I mean, by the standards of those days, were quite advanced in their approach towards minorities. These flattened versions of Sharia are very unaccommodating of minorities, just as they are unaccommodating of different Muslim schools. You think that it's dangerous for minorities. It's even dangerous for Sufis with their tombs and their. If Sufi tombs are being blown up, what's going to happen to churches? So the intolerance is built into these positivistic, flattened, mechanistic versions of Islam that are unfortunately propagated by certain parties, which are, I find, the most corrosive of the whole religion. But I belong to that other school, so maybe my judgments are not so.
I've been hogging the questions. Anybody else like to come in? Yes.
Bill Comfort. I'm retired, live in Cambridge, but I have some background in working and living in Northern Ireland after the Troubles. The two areas that I'd like to ask questions on. One, first, is a non-minority, 50% or so of the population, women in Libya. Women are traditionally the source of compassion, courage, competence and skills in not only maintaining the household, but maintaining the environment in which the household exists. So to what extent are women, as a matter of policy, being brought into policy? And the second question relates really to Ed. Is Libya going to invite Ed or somebody like him to help to establish a Libyan Broadcasting Corporation? Openness and standards and visibility.
Well, you've done a bit of that yourself.
Come to accept the standard here.
Okay. I'll begin with the second one. Ed is hereby cordially invited. I will stamp the visa myself.
I've never had a job interview. Well,
and send me the passport before I get fired as ambassador. And to come and help us. We've actually are in discussion with Thomson Reuters and a few other organizations, including Al Arabiya and so on, to try to devise training courses for young people to, I believe, more important than establishing stations, we need to help young people develop content that can be broadcast on stations, and if the stations won't take it on the internet. And there are some serious attempts in this direction. The performance of the council when it comes to broadcasting and to media has been quite miserable, and there's a lot of criticism, and I think it's right to criticize it. But there are multiple attempts at fixing this, inshallah. Regarding women, the women were not only part of this revolution. In many ways, they were the ones who started it, because the movement of the mothers and wives and sisters of the detainees of Buslim were the ones who started the first demonstrations that eventually led to the revolution. So we owe it to women that the revolution happened in the first place. And when it started, women were there from the beginning in all the demonstrations, in even some of the fighting, and in supporting the revolution. At least I know in my own case, it was my mother, my sisters, and my wife, and my daughter who gave me the courage and made me brave. I remember my sister. This is the hardest thing on going out and talking on radio and television and talking about what happened in Benghazi, was that my family was still inside. And as we went along, and I was working along with the executive team and working with the council, my nephews remained in Libya. And my sister called me. She was in Jordan at the time, and she said, "Look, I know you're worried about my sons, but if they slaughter them like sheep, do not back off, and I will never forgive you if you back off on the count of my kids." And it's that was for me very important in keeping the stand. I would have backed off if she didn't do that. And with my wife, like when I went to Benghazi, she understood that I may not come back, and she still encouraged me, and she said, if you don't go, then I don't think I can live with you. So it's so what I'm trying to say is a lot of the so-called heroism of these great heroes of this revolution was actually due to the women, and it's very important to remember this. Now, it is a major disappointment for me that the National Transitional Council doesn't have enough women in its ranks, and the government doesn't have enough women in its ranks. It's a major failure. I myself argued against this all along. When we gathered the local councils in Abu Dhabi and Doha and then in Benghazi, I made sure that the spokesperson for the entire team was a woman, Dr. Fawzia Barioun, and I believe that there is a failure there. I think the elections will change this. Women are incredibly active. They're forming societies and NGOs and so on, and I think they will succeed. And not, I don't think it's an issue of being given authority. They will take it, and with nobody doing them any favors. I think it's and they have every right to do so, and I think they will succeed. I don't think we even need a quota for that to happen. They will win, because they're actually more than 50% of the Libyan population. Yeah.
I was going to ask if any woman in the audience would like to take the lead, and one just gesticulating at the time. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Alice Wilson. I'm a researcher in Northwest Africa. I would like to ask a question about local councils. I know that the phenomenon of a local council has a history under Gaddafi's regime as a form of governance, and it's been very important in this revolution. What do you think is the future for this political form?
One of the most difficult things about this revolution is the lack of words for descriptions. What happened was Gaddafi, for about 42 years, through his rhetoric and the speeches and the Green Book and the exegesis of the Green Book and the Center for the Study of the Green Book and the conferences on the Green Book and the daily television broadcasts of phrases of the Green Book, actually managed to use every possible Arabic word that you can use to talk about democracy, including grassroots councils, including talking about parliaments, including talking about representation, including talking about parties. He polluted the vocabulary by abusing words, misusing words, cheating people through using words. So there is a suspicion of a whole dictionary of words. And yet people have to resort to some of them because there is no other word. For example, revolution itself. When you say thawra and thuwar, and you say, for example, revolutionary legitimacy, shar'iyya, thawriya, even today, as we say it, the nuances of Gaddafi's use of it haunts us in a way. And one of the things we need to do is to make sure that we don't scoff at certain ideas just because Gaddafi talked about them. And one of them is the local councils. I mean, people went out of their way to call them local councils, majalis mahaliya, and not local popular committees or lijan sha'biya mahaliya or mu'tamarat sha'biya asasiya. And yet people still, as a matter of fact, people say, this is like the mu'tamarat of Gaddafi, and even the choosing of people. This is like tas'eed, which was the word he used, and people are kind of, there's almost like they're weary of the phenomenon just because Gaddafi used the terminology and cheated people while he did that. And I think we must overcome this fear and appreciate the local councils. I am of the view that the local councils are the key to Libyan democracy because they're non-partisan, they are not dependent on funding, it's not about money, it's not about even tribes. They manage to actually, through a phenomenon of emergence, actually provide leadership that's quite credible for the people who choose this leadership. And I worked very hard with a group of young Libyans and even non-Libyans like Ed and Sohail Nakhuda and some friends who helped me to bring together the local councils in a journey to Abu Dhabi, Doha, then Benghazi, and alhamdulillah, thanks be to God, we managed to increase the seats of the National Transitional Council through that process. Unfortunately, that process did not continue. After liberation, we would have expected local elections and then more council members, men and women, populating the National Transitional Council. And I think that was a major failure. What we have now is that people are leaping to the elections and talking about election law and parties and so on, and neglecting the local councils. And that's a big mistake because I think they are key to the democracy. We have been working with various groups to try to rectify this, and I think today and yesterday there was a gathering of local councils in Tripoli. And this is very important. And even issues, for example, in the local council of Tripoli, there was a storming of the local council and objection to its leadership, but people have managed to repopulate the local council of Tripoli from more representative or with more representative people, and that helps. So what I'm saying is just because Gaddafi talked about them, we should not refrain from working with such local councils, except this time they're genuine. In many ways, I know this sounds weird and many Libyans won't like hearing this, but in many ways, what toppled Gaddafi is the actual real application of what he talked about. It wasn't all crazy. Some of what he said was actually coming from anarchistic and socialist European thinkers who promoted things like grassroots councils and so on, the Commune of Paris and he cheated people because he was never genuine about these things. But in a way, it's as if these ideas are coming back to haunt him and his dynasty, and it's people don't like to say this because they don't like to see themselves implementing anything that he would have thought of. But maybe after 10 years or so, we can get used to the idea.
I'm going to come in a second. I just want to raise one other thing because I think we should talk about this before we go. And we haven't talked about the role of NATO or the outside world. And there are those in Syria who would like to see something similar to what happened in Libya happen there. What's your very broad? I know it's an incredibly complicated political question, but ethically, what's your thoughts about that?
I can tell you about NATO in Libya first. I think that without any exaggeration, had NATO not interfered in Libya, Benghazi would have been obliterated. And this is a fact. This is a historical fact. The footage of the kilometers-long army and mercenaries with equipment and so on who were coming to actually, and they were actually bragging about what they're going to do to Benghazi and what they're going to do to the women. And I mean, there's footage of what they were saying they will be doing. And had NATO not bombed them, they would have done exactly what they promised to do, because they did it in Misrata and they did it in other places. So I have no doubt that NATO interference or intervention in Libya, which was, by the way, asked for by Libyans, including myself, I must say. I was personally involved in the drafting of the documents requesting the no-fly zone and other things. I have, though I am a theologian, and though I preach compassion, and though I hate violence, I think it was a case of where, had that violence not been inflicted upon those troops, bigger violence would have been the result. So I think in Libya it was the right thing. Is it the right thing in Syria? I'm not a Syrian. I don't know the complexities of the Syrian situation from the inside. Quite frankly, I don't think NATO is really technically capable of interfering the same way they did in Libya, for a variety of reasons. The complexities of Syria, and also the economic condition, and even the dynamics of Europe has changed, and the dynamics of Europe, the UK and the US has changed. It's a completely different situation. Should there be some form of help to the Syrian people? I think absolutely yes. I think that the Arab League tried its best. Obviously, the regime has been cynical. Everybody should be trying to help the Syrian people, but I'm not so sure that it can be done the same way. The terrain is different, the demography is different, the majority-minority relations are different. We don't have that kind of split between Alawis and Sunnis, and it's a completely different. And the Ba'ath is very different from the Libyan regime in many ways. So I would
hesitate.
I hesitate to pronounce but I can tell you that in the case of Libya, had not NATO helped us, I think we would have been destroyed. And I mean, it's very strange that a leader of a country would actually order mercenaries and his soldiers to systematically rape the women of an entire town, you know, that kind of. And when you're dealing with such a crazed person, I mean, the situation made it necessary. Now, as soon as we have liberation, my view of violence is completely different. Of course, I did carry a gun during the war. I will no longer carry a gun. I do not carry a gun anymore. And all my students gave up their guns immediately. And it's now, for me, haram to use violence anymore. But for that window, it was an absolute religious duty to fight. And this did not come easy. God knows how much I've thought of this, the pain, like as you're trying to sleep, like, and it wasn't like theoretical. My team helped NATO identify targets, so it wasn't like a theoretical thing. But I think for the first time in my life, I feel that I only then did I understand Bonhoeffer and his dilemma, you know. And understand that in some cases, like in the case of Hitler, Mussolini, Gaddafi, sometimes violence is the religious duty. But there was no point where this was done with gusto or with arrogance or with. I pray every night for the people who have died from both sides, and I am sure there are many innocent people that died in all this from both sides actually. So it's. May God forgive us all for our transgressions, but it's, you know, you can read theology and write theology, but when you're faced with these existential situations, it really matters. Theology matters in a very important manner. And I believe that the either or, what do you do in a situation like that, is very important. Syrians are now facing this. It is up to Syrians what they decide to do. There should be no outside interference without a Syrian request for it. And I don't think it will be in any way similar to Libya. It's a completely different situation.
You're very patient. Yes, no, back here.
One issue perhaps isn't at the top of the agenda but might force itself to the top of the agenda is the issue of property ownership in Libya. Literally thousands of people in Libya have had their properties confiscated by Gaddafi's regime. These properties have then been sold on to other people and then in some cases sold on again. So although, as I say, it perhaps is not at the top of the agenda, from a security point of view, if people don't start to get their properties back, and some of these properties have been confiscated for decades. My family, for instance, in Libya have properties confiscated. We've lost our property for over 30 years ago. If people don't start to have their properties returned to them, then potentially it's a cause of many civil wars.
Already in Benghazi and Tripoli, you see these big camps or sometimes governmental buildings with somebody having spray painted, this is the property of the children of so-and-so. And people are putting claims and in some cases physically going to take their property. And the National Council made many appeals to people to refrain from trying to rectify property grievances until the elected government is elected and until a procedure for discussing these matters is developed. This is easier said than done because some people are in a rush and some people worry that later on they will not have the guns to impose their will on others, so they're using the guns while they have them to take back their property. My family in 1978 lost massive property and through confiscation, and with my brothers, we've decided that we will not make any claim to anything until the elected government happens. And I know many families who have done that. And I think that's the sensible thing to do, because if you try to now get these properties, you'll be creating more issues. As you say, some of these things were sold 3-4 times, And one very important matter about properties is not simply the confiscation and the return of properties, but as Hernando de Soto, the economist, argues, property and the collateralization of property is extremely important for the starting of the economy, of economic activity. Free market cannot actually happen without property titles being proper in a way. And none of the titles in Libya are proper because Gaddafi burned the registry of lands, in the early 80s, and he deliberately did that. And he also destroyed some of the civil registry so that he can bring in entire tribes and give them Libyan citizenship to use them as his own mercenaries and people and so on. So he really messed up the entire, the bases of life as such, including economic life. So it's a huge issue, and there has to be a very complicated processes of sorting this out, and it's going to take years. I don't think there is any quick solution to this. Maybe devising some system of compensations also will be part of it, but it really is a big problem, very big problem.
We're nearly out of time. Can I just finally ask you a question about us? You talked about NATO a bit.
Yeah.
I couldn't help being struck when I was just reading a few things to prepare for this meeting of how much I'd missed has happened in Libya in the last few months. And we do have a tendency, I think, to focus very closely on a story and then to forget about it a bit. Yeah. During the war, nightly reports, now almost nothing in the papers about Libya. Do you think, maybe that doesn't matter in the media, but do you think in governmental terms Libya is now getting the sort of help that it needs from the outside world, or do you sense a lack of focus suddenly, or focus drifting away from?
No, perhaps there is even too much focus still.
You'd rather be left alone.
No, it's not like that. But if you look at the number of meetings the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have to have, it's like every day there are visitors, and when do you do the work? We had argued in the stabilization team early on that the UN should lead the assessment of needs, and that there should be a unified assessment of needs. And then we can ask each nation to say what it is that they would like to work with or work with us on, and then make an alignment. And we began to make progress on that, and then the government changed. And only now there was a workshop last week about the same issue. I believe that it's extremely important to have this unified assessment and alignment. And I believe that Libya will continue to have the attention of governments simply because it's not something on the outskirts of, I mean, it really is at the heart of many things. It's at the heart of oil supply to Germany and Italy because of the historical links. It is the heart of Russian interests in making sure that alternative gas supplies to Europe are not, I won't go there. Okay,
Mr. Ambassador.
Okay, I forget. What I'm trying to say is, it's too important for oil supply. It's also too close. I mean, Tripoli is an hour and a half from Rome by plane, and only 40 minutes from Malta. An hour and a half or 2 hours from Greece. It's like we're virtually in Europe. I mean, Tripoli is closer to London than it is to Dubai, as I have found out from so I don't think Libya will be neglected. The problem is Libyans have to figure out what it is that they want to do with their lives and what is the kind of country that they want to have. I don't think there is any shortage of friends for Libya. Many nations stood with us, and I'm always struck by the image of Benghazi Square with flags of the UK, France, Qatar, the Emirates, the US, flying, even Italian flag. I've seen the Italian flag being celebrated in the main square of Benghazi. This is unprecedented. This is like really weird. Okay, but it is so weird, and it is also so promising in many ways. If we do something with it and can develop relations of mutual respect and love and build something together, that I think that will be a lighthouse for the region. If we allow it to go to darker forces of crazy radicalization or militancy or divisive, clannish attitudes, the whole world will be at risk. It's not just a problem for Libya. So I do pray that the country will go forward in a positive direction. And I think St. Augustine has a book on this, on faith. Does it go on faith, charity, and hope, or the opposite? I can't remember the title. Does anyone remember the title? It's a small book by Augustinus, and it's about the three cardinal virtues, and they are the same virtues that Ghazali speaks of and Fakhr Razi speak of, and I believe that it is these three virtues that will build the nation: faith, love, and hope.
My apologies to those who haven't been able to ask questions, but that's a very good note to end it on. David, would you like to tell us about St. Augustine as well, please?
Well, yes, actually, when Aref talked about, possibly not coming back from Benghazi, he nearly didn't. I mean, he did get shot in Benghazi, and it was only a flesh wound, but the person next to him was killed. And we were talking about that last night. Aref, we are immensely glad that you did get back from Benghazi and also that you've been able to come here. We're also immensely grateful to you for coming here. But I have one more little question, Aref, for you that I didn't ask a question. So, and it is, what should we in Cambridge do in relation to Libya in the future?
5 things. Number 1, offer free consultancy to the universities on higher education reform. Okay. Secondly, offer free consultancy on the setting up of IT parks and IT business public sector partnerships like you do have here in Cambridge, trying to emulate this. Yeah, trying to. Number 3. make links between various departments in the universities with departments there with exchanges. It would be great, for example, to teach classics in Liptus Magna, for example, and you can do this next summer if you want. You know, number 4 is be more generous with your acceptance of Libyan students so that they can do graduate work here in Cambridge. And number 5, take Libya seriously as an area of study and send scholars to study anthropology and archaeology and even philosophy and Sufism and things like that.
By an extraordinary coincidence, last night Alice Wilson, who asked you a question, who is a social anthropologist, was telling me she wants to work in Libya, so that's a deal.
Kalam Research and Media does have a facility in Tripoli, and we have guest rooms and a library, about maybe 20,000 volumes. It's not big, not like your library here, but I hereby offer that facility. It's a private institute, and it can facilitate your links with the universities. I can introduce you to scholars and so on, so that you can. But we need exchange and communication.
Yes, do let's take that seriously. Those who are from so many disciplines here today, and well, I'm sure everyone will want to express their gratitude to you, and then go up and have a reception when you'll be able to talk together.
Thank you very much for your generosity.